Town Clerk and Chief Exec for the City of London Corporation, who coordinates the resilient function alongside our Deputy Mayor Fiona Twycross, who can't be with us today. So please make sure electronic devices are switched to silent mode to avoid any unnecessary interruptions. We've got a few items of formal business to do, and then we'll go straight to the Mayor with some questions. So let's begin with apologies for absence and Chair's announcements. I think we've had Gareth Bacon's apology, Keith Prince is substituting. I don't think there are any further apologies. Let's move on then. Declaration of interest. Members have got officers' advice. Before, are there any declarations that need to be made? Okay. Can we look at the minutes of the meeting that was held on the 18th of October and the 19th of October, so they can be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you very much. And we're now in terms of moving to questions of the Mayor. Welcome, Mr. Mayor. So, is there anything you want to say to us in opening remarks? We're aware that a press release has been done this morning. We've received a late report. We know it's not the fault of the Resilience Forum, because there's been obviously some conversations with government about wording and drafting of document. Is there anything you want to say, or should we go straight to questions?
Well, all I want to say is this, Chair. March the 29th is 5 months away. And it's just worth your committee just reminding themselves that at the moment it looks like the two options on the table that the Prime Minister is negotiating with the EU is either I would say a bad Brexit deal or no deal whatsoever. There is a serious possibility, more than any time since Article 50 was served, of a no deal situation. And that's why I'd say to you, Chair, I suspect your work over the next 5 months will accelerate as we get closer to March 29th. And this is why there is a possibility at midnight on March 29th we will have no deal, and there'll be no transitional apparatus in place. And that's why it's really important we do what we can to make sure we're as prepared as we can be for that possibility.
Okay, I think that's some good advice. Let's then move to my first question. Immediately after the referendum, we moved to, I thought, which is a very important campaign, London is Open. And of course, as things develop in terms of negotiations with government, we need to think about how do we refresh and revive those issues and give advice to, how do we still be accessible to EU citizens and to business in the event of a no-deal Brexit? What's your current thinking around that and those issues?
Just check this out. I remember vividly what I was doing on Friday after the referendum. I was in City Hall ringing up chief executives, ringing up businessmen and women, ringing up the Government Bank of England and others, not just to feel their pulse, how they were feeling, but also to ask their advice, what we can do to make sure they continue to stay in our country, they continue to invest in our country and continue to create the wealth and prosperity that is so important to our city. What was clear to me was a number of people were feeling quite scared, quite vulnerable, quite anxious about the results of the referendum. What I mean by that, they thought that the implications of the vote to leave the EU is we as a city will stop being open-minded, outward-looking, pluralistic. And the London is Open campaign was about addressing those concerns, both internally, and you'll be aware, Chair, 1 million of our fellow citizens are EU citizens, not British citizens. Across the country it's 3.5. But each day we get visitors, business people coming to our city. And that reassurance was important. That's what London is Open is all about, giving that reassurance that we may be leaving the EU, but we'll continue to be open-minded, outward-looking, pluralistic. And you will know, Chair, because you've been very complimentary about this, it's been a successful campaign. How do you measure soft power? It's very difficult to do so. What I can tell you is people feel more reassured than they otherwise would do. It's impossible to have a sliding scales comparison, but we've got to build on that, because the uncertainty caused by the negotiations, whether you're pro or anti the way the government's negotiating things, we can't escape the fact that people are worried. I was speaking last night to some business people who are worried about the future in relation to whether they should invest. I spoke to a developer last week who was pausing investment, not he may still invest in the future, not sure what to do. I was speaking to a nurse 2 weeks ago, concerned about whether they will stay here, bearing in mind the uncertain immigration status they will have because they've got to register with the Home Office and they've got to apply for secured status after 5 years. And so we've got to carry on doing what we can, Chair, and everyone around this table loves our city, loves the diversity of our city, and all of us have a role to play. And can I just thank, through you, Chair, the Assembly for the retweets, the quote tweets, the good things you've done in your own way as well in relation to getting across this really important message that London is open.
And I think, in following on from that, I think in some ways you've been a very powerful voice for business and articulating that back to government about some of the problems that business are facing. You mentioned recently about you talking to a nurse, the NHS, and about some of the problems around that. Some of these public sector organisations that play a crucial part to London's life. You know, they're almost like wealth creators in their own right. So these are difficult times that we face in terms of a potential downturn, lack of confidence for those coming months. It will be difficult, whatever happens, bad deal, no deal, those issues. Your powers are limited, but where would you, and are you prepared to use your powers to talk to the NHS and say, actually, well, what are you doing about retaining the confidence of your EU nationals that work within your sector? Can you do that? Are you able to do it? Do you feel comfortable in doing that? And is that where you, of course, in the coming months, you're going to be incredibly busy. Is that one of the areas that's going to be your priority?
I'm seeing later on today Simon Stevens. One of the things I said to London and to Simon Stevens and to the NHS generally when I became mayor is my job is to be somebody who champions the NHS but also challenges the NHS. I think we all should appreciate that there are some people who, because of their jobs, can't be advocates for the concerns they've got. We've got to respect that, particularly those in the public service, the Commissioner. There are others, and we know who they are. And one of our jobs is to listen to them, understand their concerns, and then be their advocates for them, if you like. And what's clear to me is a number of things. Firstly, the NHS, and this year we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the NHS. By the way, also the 70th anniversary of Windrush coming to our country. Why is that important? Because it reminds us that the NHS is built on the shoulders of our immigrant community and successive generations, whether it's doctors, nurses, porters, others who work in the National Health Service. In London, 11% of those who work in the NHS are from the EU and non-British citizens. 11%. So there's an issue about retention of those staff that they have, but we also have this year a record number of vacancies in the NHS, particularly amongst nurses. There's also a challenge of recruitment. Now you'll be aware the government's changed the requirements for people to come to this country, made it more difficult in relation to the NHS. Issues around the bursary, you'll be aware about. You'll be aware that the Prime Minister has sought to give some reassurance in relation to recognising qualifications, but not mention in particular the NHS and those to do with medicine. And so there's big concerns. And I just throw the question back to you, Chair. If you're a nurse or a doctor or an expert in the health sector who is currently in Poland or currently in Estonia or currently in another part of the EU, and you're thinking of leaving country of origin to improve life for yourself, but also to carry on being a practitioner, would you choose a country, a city, with an uncertain future like London and the UK, or would you go to a Paris or a Berlin or a Madrid? And we've got to realise these are talented people that the NHS needs to continue to be a fantastic health service.
Thank you for that. Let's go back to business. So I think essentially your argument shared by many is about some of the period of time immediately after Brexit, whatever happens, are going to be challenging times for us in that sense. And, our economic output will be affected in those issues. So in terms of, if there is that period of lower growth, as even more likelihood with a no deal, there will be a period of that as there is an adjustment. What role does your Brexit business hub that's just been established in supporting business. What's the vision for it? It's recently established. I think it's been well received by business. Just what
Can I explain, Chair, through you the genesis of that, which is I regularly meet business people and those who represent businesses, whether it's London First, the FSB, London Chamber of Commerce, Institute of Directors, the CBI, but also bilaterals all the time with businesses. And what's clear to me is, and really, there was a mood change over summer. It was quite clear that because of a variety of things going on in national government, the concern of businesses grew exponentially over the course of the summer. And so I wanted to gauge their views in a more scientific way. So we conducted a survey. And we've got a very good database, we've got very good contacts. And the survey was asking businesses, it was on a confidential basis, how are you feeling, how prepared are you, what contact you get from the government, how can we help? And there's a variety of other questions. We can send you a blank survey, Chair, if that helps you in relation to the questions that were asked. And we can probably anonymise some of them if you want to see some responses. And what came back to us is, the bigger businesses were better prepared. They had plans in place. They sort of knew what they were going to do. Still real concerns about the technical notices that have been sent by the government, the paucity of those, the lack of detail. The smaller businesses were completely struggling. They've just not got the resources, the expertise. They just can't do the stuff that you need them to do to continue to flourish and thrive. And so what can we do to help? And so one of the things that came from this conversation was a Brexit business portal on the London Growth Hub. And the idea was it's a one-stop shop. So you as a small business, a man or woman, you as somebody who's in a big business, could go to this hub. And if you get a chance, please, Chair, I'd advise you to go to it. And the idea is we'll give you what information we know, but then signpost you. Well, I'm not pretending that we're the oracle in relation to business acumen and knowledge. We will try and signpost you to those that can. And the important thing is this, Chair, we made sure that business groups were supportive and wanted us to do it. There's no point us duplicating good work taking place elsewhere. And so the idea is to amplify the good work taking place, and you'll see we name check and amplify and signpost good stuff taking place elsewhere. But basically to try and be a one-stop shop where we can. And it's really important we realise that, look, we can, in the Assembly, create an environment where the businesses in London will flourish better and thrive better than they otherwise did. We may not create the jobs ourselves, and that's really important. But also, Chair, it's really important for businesses to realise, particularly at these times when they feel, again, fairly or unfairly, the government's not listening to them, that they have at least a voice for them engaging with them. And that's what the Business Brexit portal is about, practical assistance to businesses large and small. And the good news, Chair, is this has been really well received. The feedback we heard is very, very positive, and we'll carry on building on it.
So I'm in agreement with you, because I was doing some research about what's happening in other EU countries for preparation. We may return back to this. So in Netherlands, they are preparing their businesses at every sector for deal, no deal, and positioning those. In Ireland, they are giving voucher grants to businesses in terms of getting expert advice and running roadshows that are oversubscribed. And you're right, actually big business will get on top of this and prepare for it and make those judgments. It's the smaller supply chains that we need to help here in London and in the UK if we're going to survive that period immediately after exit. So I think one of those issues, has government ever spoke to you about their plans about what they're going to do to talk to business about that, or have said once we've done a deal, we're immediately swinging into action, or we want you to do that?
Okay, can I say that this is us operating on a freelance basis, because there's a vacuum there. But can I just? I think it's important I share with you a couple of lines from the technical notices the government says is supposed to help businesses. Let me read you one line. Right, one advice paper titled "Structuring Your Business If There's No Brexit Deal" advises companies based in the UK but incorporated under EU corporate law that moving to a country that is still a member state may be better for their business. Right, that's from the government's technical notice. Another one is businesses can take action now to prepare, including the following: understand what the likely changes to customs and excise procedures will be to their business in light of this technical notice. Take account of the volume of their trade with the EU and any potential supply chain that may impact, and engage with other businesses in the supply chain to ensure that the necessary planning is taking place at all levels. Well, I'm really sorry. How does that help you as a small businessman or woman in Tooting High Street who does some business with the EU, or whose supply chain relies upon things that come from other parts of the EU, with the possibility now, more than ever before, that at 0001 on March the 30th, we've left the EU no transitional period. And it's just, and so you made the point about Netherlands and the Republic of Ireland. This last week, the French government published a draft no-deal bill. And that's why I say this to you, Chair, in the spirit in which it's intended. I think our role now is more important than it has been in relation to the business community at any time since the GLA was formed. I genuinely believe that.
Okay, I'm going to move on then. Yesterday's NAO report really paints a bleak picture about government's preparations about border controls for no deal. Of course, London has a number of port of entries from Heathrow, King's Cross, Port of London, and issues around that. What do you think should be the key issues that the Resilience Forum in London should be working on around those issues for that particular issues about port of entry and issues around that?
And also city airports, well,
Chair,
which you know very well.
Of course,
and so it'll be for the London Resilience team to speak to you about this later on. A number of issues concerned here. It's not simply the movement of people that may be an issue. I this summer, and you'll enjoy this, Chair, when I was away for a weekend, decided to queue at Malaga Airport in the queue that wasn't the European Union queue to see the difference, and my wife was in the European Union queue. And the numbers of people who went past me in Malaga Airport while I waited, and they were laughing because they recognised me, and I explained I was doing a test. So that's just an example of what will happen potentially in a no-deal scenario at our ports, because obviously we're in charge of our borders. At the moment, the border checks when you come from the EU take place very, very swiftly. 2 queues, and you just go through. If you're Eurostar, you've travelled Eurostar, you know what it's like. City Airport, Heathrow, the same. There's a possibility, no deal, no transitional period, and I can tell you that my understanding is that there isn't been proper preparation for the possibility of us being in a position where there is no transitional period either. That leads to, Chair, the possibility of all these ports having to take on more staff. Well, they're going to be trained. You know the security concerns. You will know, Chair, from the other work that you've done, that actually our police rely upon the intelligence sharing in relation to passenger lists. We'll come later on to talk about passenger lists, but one of those is known dangers are identified, and we work together, and those checks take place. So there's a real concern about people. There's a separate concern about goods. And one of the things that I try to get across at Mayor's Question Time, probably unsuccessfully because of the way MQT works, is I'm not sure we realise that 30% of the food that we eat comes from the European Union. An additional 11% comes from countries that have a deal with the European Union. Right? So 41% of the food we import is linked with our membership of the European Union to some extent. We pay no tariffs on those. Just pause and think about fresh fruit, fresh veg, fresh produce, if there are delays in relation to them coming into our country. Put aside the consequences of delays exporting, park that for a second, and fruit picking, park even those two things. If it's the case, and we saw reports of Chris Grayling hiring ships to bring food across. Pause that a second. Just think about the consequences about the delay. Think about the consequences if you're a restaurateur, if you're a supermarket, if you're a small shop on a high street, or if you're in food manufacturing by those situations when it comes to ports. And the ports are important because it's the speed of transition through the ports which is what worries us. Even park, forgive the pun, at the M26 and M20 being a car park rather than it being a motorway and stuff. And that's why you're right, we've got a number of ports that affect our city. Port of London, Heathrow, St Pancras, City Airport, and we've got to give really serious consideration to that. Now, the London Resilience team have simply identified some of the challenges, and I'm writing to the government today in relation to letting them know what the concerns that they have is. One of the biggest concerns they have is lack of information. The department that holds the ring for this is the MHCLG. They are key in relation to preparation and resilience. And I just have got no evidence I can share with you about any confidence that the government's got a grip on this.
Thank you for that. Are there any questions before we move on to our next further section? Okay, let's move on to aspects around food security. Caroline Russell.
Thank you. We've already started picking up on that with the comments that you just made. So I want to sort of dig into this a little bit more. In terms of us as a city making sure that we have adequate food supplies, but also from the perspective of the businesses, the big supermarkets, but also the smaller traders who supply food for Londoners. And we've had these worrying statements from the Secretary of State, that the government has practical measures to mitigate risks of disruption to supply, but then going on to say that there are no plans to deploy the army, which kind of expresses the kind of extent of radical thinking that's been going on. But sort of in particular, we've heard the British Retail Consortium saying that stockpiling of food is not a practical response, and also statements that our food supply chains are very fragile. And we've also heard that the Food and Drink Federation has said that the technical notices published so far confirming anticipated burdens on importers and exporters would, and I quote, frighten many small and medium enterprise food businesses. So we're talking about a complicated, difficult situation. So can you set out for us what actions you have taken to mitigate the impact of a no-deal Brexit on the food supply chain in London?
Yes, so let me just be clear. What we're not doing is hiring warehouses to store food. We're not doing that, and I've no intention of doing that. What we're doing is making sure that the government are aware of our concerns, and we work with others who have expertise to do this. And so the London Markets Board, which I set up, is going to be working with markets across London to make sure they're as prepared as they can be. Many of them, by the way, Caroline, haven't got the facilities to store the refrigeration equipment, and many of us haven't got larders at our own home where we can store foods for long periods of time. So the sort of what we're doing, just so you aware, is we're undertaking research to measure the amount of food insecurity in individual households in London, because you'll be aware from the work you've done as a councillor as well of poorer Londoners more disadvantaged than wealthy Londoners for obvious reasons. And we'll be using the findings of the research in conjunction with our ongoing food programme to focus particularly on low-income households. That's what we were particularly worried about. This will complement the work, as I said, of the London Markets Board, which is doing work to make sure the markets can access fresh, affordable, healthy and culturally appropriate food. Some of our markets are really important for them. What we've asked the London Resilience Forum to do is to see if there are any particular concerns for specific communities who are reliant upon specific sources of food in the supply chain, and they'll be able to speak more about that in a while. But also there is some sort of piece of good news, which is the government clearly is concerned about this as well, and they've recently appointed a new minister, David Rutley, as a DEFRA minister with responsibility for food supplies in the event of no deal. So we now have a contact person that we can contact in relation to our particular concerns in London. So it's not simply MHCLG, it's that there's a human being, a minister, a politician who we can liaise with about this.
And do you think that it is possible for you to be able to issue any statements with regard to the security of London's food supply chain, to both to reassure people or to actually encourage people to be? Are you, from what you were saying about doing this research into low-income households, are you are you suggesting that actually Londoners should possibly be stockpiling food for the no deal scenario? What's your message to Londoners on this?
It's a really good question, Caroline, and the reason why I'm sort of delaying answering that is because there's a balance to be struck between causing alarm and scaring people,
of course,
and being prudent and preparing, and it's getting that balance right that I'm not sure we're at a position yet to answer that accurately until I've got the research done, and we'll make sure we'll make sure that research is available to you as a committee as well, because I'll be keen to hear your recommendations based upon that research.
What's your timescale on that research?
We're weeks rather than months, so this side of Christmas,
Okay.
which needs to give time in relation to for the advice to be given and people to research. Just also, so my suspicion is supermarkets may be well placed. It's the sort of shops in the high street that I worry about in relation to their ability to store. Some of this stuff, as you know, is going to be refrigerated. But can I tell you the other concern I've got, Caroline, which is the price of food. So, in answer to a question from the chair, I mentioned that the amount of food that comes from the EU and countries with the deal. If it's the case that we leave without any deal with EU and go to WTO terms, that could mean the increase in food prices by more than 20%. These are WTO terms based upon the food that we get from the EU and the country that deal with the EU. So the additional concern I've got, Caroline, in relation to your very good question, which is actually one thing that concerns me in relation to advice we give to Londoners, is the cost of food going up post March the 29th. What we don't want to do is make that go up in advance of March 29th if it's the case we do a deal. That's why there's a fine balance to be struck between alarming, scaremongering, but also people being properly planned. So what I'll do is, with the Chair's permission, make sure we have that research available to you as well, and we'll hope to come up with advice that we can all agree on. I think we should give out one piece of advice rather than me saying one thing, the government saying something else, and that doesn't work for anybody.
Well, I mean, certainly the Londoners need to have time to prepare. Absolutely. If they need to prepare.
And also the faith communities, you'll be aware of the brilliant network of support we've got across London of sort of citizens who do good things, and we need to make sure we cascade the advice to them as well, because they'll be an integral part if, and this is a big if it's the case we have no deal with the EU with no transitional period.
Yep, thank you very much.
Okay, shall we move on then to medicine supply and availability? Assembly Member Keith Prince.
Thank you. Just before I start though, can I commend you, Mr Mayor, on getting Crossrail's board to publish their minutes? You announced that yesterday. And that's important to, I think that Crossrail is important to London's economy, so, credit where it's due. So I understand that you've asked the Resilience Forum to establish the impact of no-deal Brexit on critical areas such as medicines and access to medicines and energy. What exactly is the Forum doing to prepare for a no-deal scenario in these situations? Yeah, so
John will be able to explain who's on the Forum, but a key part of the Forum is the NHS, which is really important because they can give advice. One of the issues that, again, John will be able to explain more when he speaks to you is some of the advice, for good reasons, because they're a national body. There's an issue about the information they could share, and that's one of the things that we'll be making clear to government with a bit more shared information. The basic position is this: the NHS aren't yet making plans to stockpile medicines post March 29th. The drug companies are reported to be doing that, though, in advance of the possibility of this happening. My understanding is the drug companies may be stockpiling 6 weeks' worth of medicines post March the 29th. And again, my understanding is that 50% of the medicines we use in this country come from the European Union, and so it's a huge source of concern. As far as the preparation that we in City Hall can do, it's really important that we realise our role is strategy. Our role is to make sure we give the advice to the government, we work with the NHS, and so we'll carry on, being a strategic body and giving the advice that's required. One of the things we can do, though, Senator Prince, is to make sure that we, in an environment that is private, hear from the NHS what their concerns are. If they can't make these points to government, we make those points to the government and advocate on behalf of the NHS. That's just in medicines. We can come on later on staff and stuff if you want to.
Sure. I mean, that's an interesting point, because it does appear that the NHS are getting information that we are not privileged to. Is there no way that you could perhaps approach...
I think it's more the NHS have been given some... They've been given guidance from the government. The NHS have got to be very careful with the information they share with the public. The NHS will have a channel to get things back to the government. The Secretary of State for Health this week gave evidence to the Select Committee. He looked pretty confident, which surprised me in relation to the evidence he gave, and for others to look at the evidence he gave to the Select Committee. His evidence was in stark contrast to the evidence given to the same Select Committee by the drug companies, incidentally. And so I'm a bit concerned about the government understanding the concerns of the NHS. And so what I can do, and I will do, is with their permission make sure we make public whatever concerns they've got, but also lobby for the changes they need. But at the moment, the NHS position is that they're not stockpiling medicines post March 29th. But you'll be aware, Keith, that actually a not insignificant amount of medicines do need to be kept at a certain temperature, which leads to all sorts of issues. And one of the things explored by the Health Select Committee this week was whether the NHS has the refrigeration facilities to store these medicines over a period of time. And my understanding again is that it could take up to a year to get the refrigeration capacity up to speed. We've not got a year. And so this is why I said to you, I mean, I wasn't reassured, if I'm being frank, as far as form their judgment, that the Secretary of State understood and had a grip of this issue. I was quite concerned about what the drug companies were saying about the consequences of a no deal.
Okay. There's a shelf life aspect with some products
Exactly
as well.
right.
But the point I'm trying to get to actually is, could you endeavour to open a line of communication between yourself and whichever minister it may be on a confidential basis so that you can get that information? Because we know, or we're fairly confident that we know, that the NHS are being given different information. You've already indicated to what we are getting. Now, clearly, there's going to have to be a level of trust there, but surely, I believe you should know this top-line information, even if you're not able to share it.
Keith, I mean, I'm happy for my office to relay to you, Chair, the problems we've had with getting data from the government. I mean, it's been a challenge, including, and you're right, you'd expect the elected Mayor of London to have this information, including in relation to the work of the Resilience Forum. Some of the data, some of the information they were willing to share with the Chair, Fiona Twycross, and they were very reluctant for that to be passed on. And so there is this issue about sharing of information. One of the points I'll make in my letter to the government when I send them the report is the issue of sharing data. And if it's the issue, and I'm always happy to give undertakings to government about confidentiality, is often one of the issues about being a Privy Council. You can give those assurances and sort of, you know, there's an agreement and stuff. So I'm as concerned as you are, Keith, and so I'm happy, Chair, for my office to share with you some of the challenges Fiona's had, so you understand. And any assistance that somebody can give would be appreciated.
Okay, thank you. And the only other thing then really is, what are you planning to share with the public around? You know, can you at this moment, for instance, give the public an assurance that you're reasonably confident that there won't be a problem with the medical suppliers because of the information you've had from the medical companies and from the NHS?
At this stage, I'm not in a position to answer the question whether, if there's a no-deal scenario with any transitional period, how prepared we are in the NHS, well, I say we, the NHS, going forward. The three areas of concerns I have is in relation to staff, what happens in relation to, if you're a doctor working in London, or a nurse, or another medic, and you are told there's no deal, and there are uncertainties around Theresa May's position on immigration status of these EU citizens, what confidence do I have that you're not going to return to country of origin or go to another country in the EU because of your concerns? So staff's a big issue for me. I can't answer that question about reassuring Londoners. Second issue is medicine, in relation to whether we've got enough medicine going forward if there's a no-deal scenario, no transitional period, bearing in mind the concerns I've expressed about, and you mentioned shelf life, refrigeration. The third issue that worries me is in relation to new medicines coming on stream. So because we're a member of the European Union, and until recently, the European Medicines Agency had a bright future in London, it's now leaving to go to Amsterdam. The market in the EU is 500 million. So if you're a pharmaceutical company, you want approval as soon as possible of your medicines, cancer medicines, antivirals, and all the rest of it, because the market's huge. If you're a small market, you're not a priority. So Australia, for example, there's a 15-month lag between a medicine being given approval in our country, in the EU, than going to Australia, for obvious reasons. So the third part of my concern is what happens in the future in relation to medical advances and in relation to medicine. So, you know, I simply can't give the assurances that you'd like me to give. And that's why it's really important, again, that you know, over the next few weeks and months, we get these answers from the government, because it's really important everyone's reassured. And this is not scaremongering, by the way. We'd be criticised, Keith, I can tell you, we'd be criticised if we weren't asking these questions and doing this preparedness in advance of March 29th.
But you can at least assure Londoners that you are doing all that you can.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll carry on doing so, and any assistance the Chair can give, and that's why I'm keen to share with the Chair the problems we've had in relation to information from central government would really help me.
Okay, thank you.
Assembly Member Pidgeon.
I just want to pick up in this area the threat to some cancer treatments, because we're withdrawing from Euratom. This means that the secure and safe supply of medical radioisotopes, which cannot be stockpiled because they decay quickly, could really have an impact on cancer patients in London. I'm wondering around that, what specific representations you've been putting to the government about this very specific area of medicine, and whether perhaps you agree with I think the Chief Executive of the Association of British Pharmaceutical Industry. He has or she has said that they think you need some sort of fast-track lanes at ports for certain medicines in order they can get through, whether that's the sort of proposal you're putting forward to government.
Yeah, and just worth reminding ourselves, in case we just focus just on the nodal scenario, there are a number of other scenarios. So one scenario could be, and people call this the blindfold Brexit, where basically we agree a deal with the EU without working out the details, and that means we get a transitional period where all this stuff is kicked down the road.
Kind of fingers crossed.
Yeah, and so the reason I mention that is because I don't want to alarm people, those who suffer from cancer or those with other illnesses who are worried about their medicines may not be available post March 29th. We've got to reassure those people in relation to there are a number of scenarios in front of us going forward, and so we are working with the NHS in relation to making sure they can make these points to the Department for Health. But also making these points to MHCLG as well. So just to reassure, it's not simply me making the points to government. The NHS is making these points to the Department of Health and making them to government as well. And so there'll be a number of people making these points. And of course, separately, the practitioners through the BMA and other organisations are also making, you mentioned one, I'm also making these points to the government as well. So hopefully, the government realise that, and look, the EU don't want to punish us, don't want to punish cancer sufferers, and the EU, I can assure you, wouldn't allow a situation where anybody's health deteriorated because a drug that was available before March 29th, because of issues around trade, isn't available in the future. So fingers crossed those people you're talking about wouldn't suffer detrimentally, but it's a possibility.
It's just an issue I think needs to be.
Absolutely right.
You could think of drugs, you think of stockpiling pills and whatever.
Yeah.
This is something that cannot be stockpiled. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, let's go back to status of EU nationals. Back to Assembly Member Russell.
Thank you. Yes, just thinking about EU nationals who are living here in London, it's been a very unsettling period since the referendum back in 2016, but I think as the more information comes out about the risks of a potential no-deal Brexit, people are particularly concerned, and it's there's with freedom of movement comes rights to social security, to healthcare, to education, and also obviously there are as people are kind of wondering whether they will or will not qualify for settled status, whether their family members will be able to be here with them in London, or whether family members who are not here at the moment will be able to join them in London. So for EU citizens living in London at the moment, there's concern and anxiety about all of this. So is there anything that you are planning to do to support EU nationals in London as they go through the process of applying for settled status?
Yes, thank you for the question. So two things straight away that I can say we're doing as an example is, the Chair asked me about the support we're giving to businesses and the Business Brexit portal. A number of months ago, we set up an EU portal for the citizens you're talking about. And so you as a citizen could go to the website and find information. The problem is the government's got no certainty about the processes. And so, one of the things I've been saying for the last 2.5 years, there's got to be a cast iron guarantee to EU citizens with a clear direction of how they get from a route from being an EU citizen to becoming secure status and a British citizen if they want it. That's not been forthcoming. So we've got some information on the EU portal, but it's not satisfactory because the government's not published the information. So I can signpost you to other places, but once we've got more information, we'll have it on the portal. So we've got what we know so far. Separately, the work that Matthew Wright has been doing around integration is providing a route for citizenship for those in London. Not just EU, but also non-EU. If you sort of the Windrush type situation, as well as EU and stuff. So, what we'll be doing once we know more about the process is to provide assistance to people. It could be information, it could be signposting, and we also have staff doing this work to assist people get their secured status. The good news is there are some charities and community groups doing some of this work, and as I mentioned, MQTs, we're employing people to do outreach work as well to make sure we reach those people who need this help. And just to remind you, there are two separate issues. One is the registration requirement placed upon these EU citizens, and that basically means registering with the UKBA. Separately is after 5 years having secured status. But let me tell you the concern. You and I both know that Theresa May's tried to reassure these EU citizens. Well, 6 weeks ago, the head of the ERG, who could become the next leader of the Conservative Party, said, according to him, this is Jacob Rees-Mogg, he thinks EU citizens in the future should be treated the same as non-EU citizens. So you imagine now, you're an Italian living in London for the last 2 years. You're on the one day reassured by Theresa May, you'll have secured status if you stay here 5 years. But on the other hand, you're being told if Jacob Rees-Mogg has his way, there's no route to secured status after 5 years' time. Now, if there's a job in Berlin or a job in Paris or the uncertainty here, what are you going to choose?
Obviously.
And that's why it's really important we understand the concerns. And that's why, Chair, I began by saying we've got to understand these are human beings who are affected, and that's why it's really important that we give them the reassurance they need.
And do you have any sense about the timescale for the government to be able to give you more information so that we can do more for these citizens?
No, that's what's so frustrating, Caroline. What I've been calling for some time now is, look, I accept the proposition either everything is agreed or nothing is agreed. I accept that in any negotiation. But actually, you can't use human beings as bargaining chips. Forget all that and just give a cast-iron guarantee now and say, irrespective of what happens, those EU citizens who are here will be able to stay here. Okay? You can work out the cut-off date. It could be March 29th. It could be... That's a discussion to be had. The government could do that very easily, and they could draft a bill, get it done, and that's done. And so until the EU deal is done, nothing is agreed. That's why it's really important to understand the proposition, the phrase is either everything is agreed or nothing's agreed. So even the speech made by Theresa May saying, you know what, secure status, 5 years, even that could be taken off the table.
Yeah. It's, yeah, I mean...
These are human beings.
I don't know what to say.
Well, these are your neighbours. They're people who work in the GLA. They're people who work in TfL. They're police officers. They're Londoners. They contribute to our city. And that is not a way to treat people.
Yeah. Indeed. It's shocking. You've also been one of the people who has, and it's great that you have, called for a people's vote on the... on the terms of leaving the EU. At the moment, we're having this conversation about the resilience of London and what leaving the EU means, and yet there's absolutely no certainty about, what the terms of that deal should be. So what do you see as the mechanisms by which a vote on the detail of leaving might be called?
Well, first, anybody who can predict what will happen shouldn't be believed. And so take that with what I say with a pinch of salt. But there is a route in relation to getting some certainty around what we have now. Because of the court case brought by Gina Miller and because of good opposition in Parliament, we now know there's going to be a vote on the deal that our government does with the European Union. We've been told it should be a meaningful vote, which must therefore allow the possibility of an amendment to the motion put down by the government. The idea of there being no amendment isn't a meaningful vote. So what the route is the government completes the negotiations with the European Union, and they'll either have, in my view, a bad Brexit deal, or there'll be no deal whatsoever. They put that to Parliament. Parliament has the ability to amend that. I suspect Parliament will reject the deal that the government does. Why? Because Theresa May can't get agreement from her cabinet or her party, let alone Parliament. You'll be aware of the 6 tests the Labour Party, Her Majesty's official opposition, have set out. You'll be aware of the concerns of the Green Party, the Lib Dems, the SNP, part of the DUP for a second. So I predict that Parliament will reject the deal that the government does. The Labour Party will then move an amendment, I suspect, for a general election. Because if you're a Labour politician and you're Her Majesty's official opposition, you want this shower out and you want to form a government. I suspect the move to a general election that the Labour Party won't succeed in a vote in the House of Commons because of the numbers required. You'll be aware of the Parliament Act in relation to the votes that are required. And then I'm hoping there'll be an amendment put down for the British public to have a say for the first time on the outcome of the negotiations. Do they accept the deal done by the Prime Minister or not, with the option of staying in the European Union? And if that amendment is passed, that allows the British public to have a say on the outcome of the negotiations with the option of staying in the European Union. And why is that important? Because rather than promises being made which are unrealistic or untruths or lies or deceptions, such as once we leave the EU, it'll be possible to have access to the single market. Boris Johnson, June 2016, untrue. Doing a deal with the EU will be the easiest trade deal in history. Liam Fox, summer 2016. You can do a trade deal with the European Union during the afternoon over a cup of tea and a scone. Leader of the UKIP at 2016. So in those circumstances, you can understand people vote to leave the EU. Well, now we know what the deal is, whatever the Prime Minister secures. The British public can say, we accept this, we understand there'll be challenges, we understand for the short term there may be challenges, but it's a price worth paying, or they'll decide to stay in the European Union. And that's an option I think the British public should have. And I think I can't think of anything more democratic or more British than trusting the British people.
Thank you.
Assembly Member Prince.
Thank you. Mr Mayor, you quite rightly referred to summer 2016 and what people said in 2016. You now seem to be joining the voices calling for a second referendum. But in 2016 yourself, in the summer, July, you claimed the establishment needs to respect the result and that a second referendum would lead to a more cynicism amongst voters. Why have you changed your views?
Well, I thought I'd explain this, but I'll explain again. So what we were told 2 years ago is that it's possible to do a good deal with the European Union. I spent the last 2 years, probably I spent more time with government ministers than Nicola Sturgeon and Carwyn Jones put together. I met David Davis 8 times. On a number of occasions I took experts with me to try and get a good deal, because it's really important we get a good deal with the European Union. I've been pragmatic. Single market access, membership of the customs union, cast-iron guarantee for EU citizens, a transitional period. I've even gone to Brussels, met with EU presidents, EU commissioners, EU politicians, to persuade them of the why it's in their interests to have a good deal with us. And what I've said to both them and our government...
you failed to get a good deal as well then?
What I've said to our government and the EU is an extreme hard Brexit is bad for everyone. Bad for us, bad for Europe. The jobs will go to not Paris, Brussels and Berlin. I've said to our friends in Brussels, they'll go to Singapore, Hong Kong and New York. What's clear though, over the course of this summer, is the option of a good deal is gone. There are only 2 things left on the table now. One is a bad Brexit deal and one is no deal. Why? Because Theresa May is held hostage by her party. Why? Because she can't get agreement around her cabinet, let alone her party. Why? Because the ERG is making threats to her in relation to her ability to carry on being leader. Why? Because she served the Article 50 too soon without realising what she wanted. Why? Because she called a general election when she didn't need to, and meant the DUP had more powers than they deserved to have. Why? Because she's going to answer to the backstop issue in relation to Northern Ireland. Why? Because her solution in relation to the issues with the border in Northern Ireland about some sort of technological solution, or the ERG solution about some sort of technological solution, it doesn't work. But also it is at risk of jeopardising the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement was an amazing piece of work, because after decades of troubles, I think more than 3,000 people died during the troubles. I grew up in London in the 70s and 80s and was well aware of the consequences of the disturbances there were. There was a sophisticated solution to the border issue whereby there was no border between the north of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, but at the same time, Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom and was part of Great Britain as well. And all that is being risked because of the dogma of Theresa May and her party.
Right, I don't want to go into the detail of that particular aspect because I'm not sure that you could just blame the government.
Well, let me see why I can. Because one way where there's no issue with the border is for us to continue to be members of the single market. If we stay in the single market, albeit outside the European Union, we stay in the customs union, there is no border issue. One of the things that I've been saying, it's possible to have a deal with the European Union, even if we've left the EU, that solves the border issue, but also means we're not as badly worse off as we are with an extreme bad Brexit, is by us having membership of the single market and customs union. Why can that not happen? Because your party's split, mate.
Well, I'm not sure that your party is singing from the
I'm
same
really happy to
hymnship
compare
either.
which of our parties more divided
it depends
all day
who
long.
you talk to.
All day long.
Who you talk to as to what your particular party, including your leaders' views on whether we should leave or not. But you did write actually again in 2016 that it's our turn to make one of those big once-in-a-lifetime decisions that would determine our future. As a decision we won't be able to reverse. That was what you thought, but you seem to have changed your mind on that.
No, what I'm saying is that the British public should have a say on the outcome of the negotiations. So I'm not saying that we have a rerun, we have a best of three, we have a best of five. What I'm saying is, now that we know the terms of the deal the Prime Minister has done, which isn't a good Brexit deal, by the way, it's a bad Brexit deal or it's no deal whatsoever, the British public should have the option of deciding whether they accept or reject that, but also staying in the European Union. What's clear over the last 2 years is that the British public was sold lies, untruths, mistruths and deceptions. Those have been uncovered and the will of the British people is changing. But even if you park that, what are you so scared of in relation to the British public having a say in the deal that your Prime Minister has negotiated? If it's such a good deal, let them have a say.
Well, personally, I'm not scared of the public having a say on the deal.
So are you joining the campaign for a people's vote?
I think that,
you heard it here first, and there's a journalist in the room. Keith Prince has changed his mind and now backs a people's vote.
Well, I haven't changed my mind.
Oh, okay. So you are scared of the British public?
Because you haven't let me finish what I was about to say, which is, I don't particularly have a problem with asking the people of their views on the deal, but I certainly would not want a second referendum on whether or not we stay or leave.
Well, can I tell you, Chair?
We've made that decision. That decision's been made, but I do accept that, the deal. There is a lot of work to be done in relation to the deal, and that at the moment, what I've seen isn't great.
Well, I think that's criticism of your Prime Minister rather than me, with respect. But
I wasn't criticising you at that moment.
Yeah, but as far as, look, I think we're in danger of having a political debate, which I don't want to waste the committee's time.
Yeah. Okay, I've got two Assembly members who want to come in on this particular issue. Assembly Member Whittle.
Mr Mayor, I think we shouldn't, not that you are, but I think we shouldn't confuse the issue of Brexit and what people were voting on with the absolute appalling display of incompetence, weakness, what have you, that we've had from your party. Two different things, but they shouldn't be conflated. They shouldn't be made the reason. Hang on, shouldn't be made. Sorry, they shouldn't be made the reason for a vote, as it were. What I'd say to you is that when you took over as mayor, you said, I want to be mayor for all Londoners. That includes 40% of people who voted to leave. I wonder what you think they would feel about what you're saying now, given the fact that there is, and trust me, I've searched high and low, there isn't a bit of evidence that any Brexiteer voters want a second referendum. There's not a bit. It is coming purely from Remain voters. That's fine. If they want to call for that, that's fine, including you. But the fact is, to somehow say that this is something that people are desperate for because it's actually, they didn't understand, it seems to me that it was Brexiteers perhaps who understood very clearly what it meant, and Remainers who somehow didn't understand what it was all about. 40% of Londoners voted to leave. You have to think of those, Mr Mayor, being mayor of all London.
Chair, let me try and unpackage some of the points made by the Assembly member. Firstly, look, I accept and I've said this on a number of occasions, and it's been used against me just this morning, the results of the referendum. The British public, whether I like it or not, voted to leave the EU. The right to distinguish that decision from the negotiations the government's conducted over the last 2 or so years. What's clear now is the only deal this government's either able or willing to do is a bad Brexit deal or no deal whatsoever. That is a million miles away from what was promised 2 or so years ago. And even you would have to accept, that there can't have been many people who voted to leave the EU to make themselves poorer. Even you would have to accept there aren't many people who voted to leave the EU to damage the NHS. You have to accept there aren't many people who voted to leave the EU. Well, so
this is on the stump stuff. You can go through all of those claims. You can go through counter claims.
But Chair, with respect, then,
all my point about really, Mr. Mayor, was that you talk about it about people not knowing what the deal or a bad deal would be and all the rest of it. But you're now talking about actually we should have an option for remaining. And I think that your instinct before, at the very beginning, in accepting the vote was a good democratic instinct. And it worries me very much the situation that could come about psychologically in people's minds if they think democracy is somehow or other basically being ignored, which you are effectively urging.
tell you, Chair, the problem with the analysis of the Assembly member is, on the one hand, he's saying what an appalling deal the Prime Minister has done and how the negotiations have been appalling. On the other hand, he's accepting her framing of the false choice. What is her framing of the false choice? Her framing is either you get there's no deal, catastrophic, or you've got to accept my bad deal that I've done. Under your framing, those are the two options.
Mr. Mayor, what I'm saying is people were not voting 2 years ago, or whatever it was now, on the type of deal as such. That wasn't their main concern. Their main concern might have been, if you like, quite big ideas or whatever, or philosophical ideas or whatever, but they were not voting on what a deal would be or not, or whether indeed we left without a deal. The point is, we can go on and on talking about the deal. I will be the first to say it's been absolutely appalling the way that they've been trying to do a deal. No one is denying that. What I'm thinking is, as Mayor of London, you've got to remember that 40% of Londoners voted to leave. There is not a single bit of evidence that they want another vote. This is a purely Remain argument, Mr. Mayor.
Well, I'm not sure if that's right, by the way. But
some of the polling is indicating some
right.
people, not about...
I'm not, by the way, frightened of a sector. It's nothing to do with that. Bring it on. But the fact is that this would be appalling for democracy. You are one of the major, if you like, figures of our democracy. So that's what you've got to remember.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
I think polling is shifting and showing that. What I wanted to pick up, Mr. Mayor, thank you for all your answers this morning, and those of us who are so concerned about this. I think it's reassuring the Mayor of London's doing everything within his powers to try to make sure London's properly represented at the table. But you talk about what you're doing with government, but actually you set out a very clear scenario how we could have a people's vote on the final deal. What influence are you having on the official opposition to make sure they come behind that?
It's a very fair question, and it's right that you asked me that. So I spent some time in Liverpool during the APAC conference. I'm not giving away secrets, Chair, in case you're worried about me breaching party discipline here. But one of the things I was keen, one of the things I was there for a variety of reasons, but one of the things I was keen to do is make sure that a motion was passed at our conference, which kept all the options on the table, including a public vote. Why? Because as a Labour politician, of course I want a general election. I want my party to be in government. You'll blame me for saying that. But if we can't achieve that for the reasons I've said in answer to questions that you and Caroline were alluding to, then I think the next best thing is a public vote. And it's really important we get that public vote. And just to reassure you, that is Labour policy. And what I would hope is, if it is the case that if it's the case that the deal that Theresa May does, that Peter Whittle is saying we should accept, irrespective of how poor it is rejected by Parliament. If the general election amendment is rejected by Parliament, then it follows that an amendment should be put down for there to be a public vote. And I would hope that there are enough people in Parliament who realise that a bad Brexit a bad Brexit deal and a no deal is so bad that the public should have a say on those, with the option of staying in the EU.
Great, thank you.
Okay, let's move back on to some outstanding issues around security and policing, and back to Assembly Member Pidgeon to do those questions.
Yes, thank you. I mean, this is an area I'm hugely worried about, that London and Londoners and the country could be less safe with the Brexit deal or no deal on the table. Europol, European arrest warrants, the information sharing that goes on. I know you set down 6 red lines around this. Have you or your Deputy Mayor for Policing now met with the Secretary of State or Home Secretary to discuss this? And is there any progress in this area you can report?
I've not yet met on a one-to-one this Home Secretary, despite requests. So that's the first point. Secondly, the Commissioner has raised her concerns through the official police. There's a national police work taking place, and the Met Police Service is very well represented there. We've got a separate team that does work in relation to this area, a unit work in relation to this. I know Deputy Commissioner Sir Craig Mackey has spoken to you. It's a national police unit that does work in relation to this, and the Met Police is represented there. The 6 red lines haven't been met in relation to the concerns we've got. Let me just give you one number, which is really worth the chair you having. The European Criminal Records Information System, which gives the UK access to criminal records through the EU. In 2017, 162,000 requests were made. There's a possibility, Chair, that if there's no deal with no transition, either everything's agreed or nothing's agreed, we can't use this 0001 March the 30th. Right? This will be a godsend if you're a criminal. If you're involved in organised crime, this is a godsend. If you're somebody thinking about doing cross-border crime, this is a godsend. And again, the consequences of a bad Brexit deal or a no deal are extremely serious on policing, but also security as well. I should say, Karen, one of the meetings I have tomorrow in Brussels is with the EU Commission on Security, Julian King.
Yes, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you is what are you going to be raising with him specifically?
Yeah, I mean, and the key thing, just to reassure colleagues when I meet with European colleagues, is to explain to them the importance of a good deal. It's really important for them and for us. And so I'll be asking, Sir Julian about what he thinks the consequences of us doing no deal are, but also what he thinks we can still do on a bilateral basis. I think that the word used was clunky in relation to what happens on a bilateral basis if we leave. We're going to make 27 separate arrangements. We're going to have staff involved in the bureaucracy of chasing up searches and stuff. What he thinks will happen in the reality, I suspect there'll only be so much he can say publicly. I don't think you can compromise safety and security in relation to these things. So just like I said earlier on, Caroline, that I think you shouldn't use people as bargaining chips. I don't think you should use security as bargaining chips, and that's a point I'll make to Sir Julian. I don't think, if it's the case we haven't got a deal, Chair, on March 29th, I think they shouldn't be compromising on our security and their security as well. It's a two-way relationship. They benefit as well. And I'll be making that point in a courteous and polite way with him as well.
So are you hopeful that whatever happens, we should be able to still have access, if it's a sort of bilateral agreement, to all these databases? Because real-time information is what has helped prevent some of these terrorist attacks in our country and in the rest of Europe.
So when I last met David Davis, one of the meetings I met with him, he gave me that assurance that even if we didn't do a deal, the EU would see sense. And in that very same day, I think Michel Barnier gave a speech to the opposite, saying basically either everything's agreed or nothing's agreed. This is part of the package of, how can you allow somebody who's not a member of the EU to have access to Europol?
Yeah.
On the same terms as the EU27. He made that understandable point. How can you allow somebody who's not a member of the EU, who's not paid the fees, to have access to the Schengen information system? How is it equitable and just for somebody who's not in the EU, doesn't want to join the club, to have access to passenger information? And so I can understand on a sort of general level the points he's making. My concern is security and safety, and so there is a contradiction between what I was told by the government about what happened if there's no deal, but also what the EU are saying. and it is a worry.
It's a huge worry. I think the government just have been burying their head in the sand on these issues and just think it will be all right on the night, and it clearly isn't going to be. What has the Metropolitan Police Commissioner advised you as to how a no deal will impact on the ability of the Met to police effectively in the immediate aftermath and over the longer term?
Well, there are a number of things, conversations we have with the police in relation to this, and there are a number of issues. There are Met Police officers, Met Police staff, Met Police CSOs who are EU citizens and not British citizens. There's an impact there in relation to people, human beings. There's an impact in relation to cross-border cooperation in relation to, you mentioned some of the European arrest warrant, Schengen, Europol, there's a consequence there. The NCA does lots of work, the National Crime Agency, with lots of work with Europe. I received a presentation this week at the Serious Crime, Violent Crime Task Force meeting from the NCA about the cross-border stuff, particularly with Baltic countries and guns and all the big concerns in relation to that. And so it's a huge source of concern. And just to give you one example of concern, a real example that affects our communities. Think about the drugs in London. There is evidence that a lot of this comes from Colombia, not part of the EU, but working together as the EU, we're more effective in relation to stopping the drugs coming from Colombia than we will be as the UK outside the EU. And that has a direct impact on violent crime in our cities. And so we're very concerned. As I said, there's a national police unit that the Met Police Service have a huge role in that is working with the Home Office. We received some funding from the Treasury, the police did, the NCA and the Met Police, to do some contingency planning. But we were hoping that would not be required in relation to the work they do, because we'd reach a deal, and there's still some hope we can do a deal with the EU in relation to this.
And the issue of drug trade and coming for Colombia, obviously the border force are critical in this, and yet... You'll have seen, and I'm sure I've stolen your question, but you will have seen the concern raised by the NAO and others this week about the confidence they've got in our border forces. And Chair, you mentioned the ports in London. I think I interrupted Caroline Pigeon. The point she was going to make, I'm sure, was that actually, I'm sorry for this, I apologise, we're on the same wavelength. It's just that if the NAO are saying that now, what's going to happen in the future in relation to this issue, and it's a real issue. And again, you know, Peter Whittle may say I'm not a Democrat, but you know, did the British people realise that UKBA wouldn't have the staff to make sure we're safe from these sorts of issues when they voted to leave the European Union? So is this something that the Commission and others are also looking at in terms of potential for increased drugs coming in and the links to county lines and all the other concerns?
I mean, all these things are being explored by the National Police Unit, and as I said to you, what I can reassure you about is that actually because we're the Met Police Service, the biggest police service in the country, we're well placed to make sure they know our concerns in relation to these issues. Kent's another example. Kent's got big issues, not just in relation to the M26 and M20 being turned into a car park, but in relation to the ports that come into Kent, you know, Dover, Dover, Felixstowe, Folkestone, and all the rest.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Mayor, you're meeting a number of people in Brussels. Can you just remind us who you're meeting?
I've not got the complete list. I do know two of the names. One of them is Michel Barnier, who's negotiating on behalf of the European Union. Secondly is the Security Commissioner, who's a Brit, by the way, so Julian King. Another example, we've got a Brit who's in charge of security in the EU. We're giving that up. I mean, it just, you know, but, you know, as some would say, that's a great thing. And I'm also meeting some vice presidents, I think, as well. I've not got a list here, but I'm sure we can make sure available to you this afternoon.
And virtually the case that you're going to be making is virtually on the lines on security that you've just made during that answer to that question, and of Barnier, much more wider issues.
Yeah, no, the key thing is that it may be the case that we're leaving the EU, but we're not leaving Europe. And we need to have good relationships with Brussels and with EU. It's really important. Also, Chair, I should have said, in addition to going to Brussels tomorrow, later on this year, I'll be going to Paris, Berlin and Dublin, because one of the things you said to me in your first questions was jobs and the economy. And what it's about is, look, we may be leaving the EU, but we're not leaving Europe. We still want to do trade with these countries. We want to build on the good relationships we have with them, make sure they go deeper and are more meaningful. I'm concerned that often when you're overseas and you read British newspapers, you may get the wrong impression that somehow we're anti-Europe. And even, you know, people who voted to leave the EU aren't anti-Europe. They just don't want to stay in the European Union, I think, you know, and there are other concerns they've got. And I wouldn't want an impression to be created amongst people in Brussels that even though we could be leaving the EU, we're somehow going to be hostile towards our friends, family in the European Union.
Okay, can I thank you for the way you've answered these questions? We'll follow up with the various bits of information that will be used for us. We obviously want to reflect on what you've told us today and our second session for this morning, and we will come back to you and reflect on what you've said to us. Thanks very much. Thank you. So at that point, I think we need to note the report and note the answers that the Mayor has given us. And now we welcome John Barradell, as well as who's going to be supported by John Hetherington, Head of Resilience, located with the London Fire Brigade. Welcome, John. You're Deputy Chair of London Resilience Forum, but you're also, and I mentioned earlier, let's give you a proper title to your day job, Town Clerk and Chief Exec of the City of London Corporation. Thank you very much for that. Do you want to make an opening statement first before we go into our questions?
If I could just say a few introductory remarks, Chair, if I can. First of all, you're right, I'm here as Deputy Chair of the London Resilience Forum, representing that group, and I'll give a bit more detail of the context of the Resilience Forum so that there's clarity around what its purpose and responsibilities are, along with the work programme that we're currently undertaking with that may be of help to you. In essence, what we're doing here is giving a view, or offering a view, on the preparedness of the various agencies within the Resilience Partnership for the no deal and other alternative Brexits, and you'll be aware that the circumstances continue to change and what we're likely to face. So, of course, this is an ever-moving feast, an ever-moving picture. For clarity, in terms of the Resilience Forum itself, there are around 104 organisations that are represented on it. They range from the emergency services that you'll know about, all of London's local authorities, both at the London level and at the local level, all of the statutory health providers, Environment Agency, Great London Authority itself. And the role there is to assess risks, make sure that appropriate plans are put in place and are available, to provide information and ensure that's available to the public, to share information between the individual organisations, and make sure that there is advice and guidance given to businesses and other organisations within London. There's an additional 63 organisations that also participate, so you can see the scale of this is rather large, and that includes faith groups around London, and the idea here is for sharing information and cooperating between those agencies for the benefit of London's resilience itself. In addition to that, of course, we have the business sector and various representative groups for London's employers, along with the faith and other sectors within London itself. The partnership meets on a regular basis. As I said, it's chaired by the Deputy Mayor and has a number of work strands and guidance and notes with it. So the idea here is very much one of coordination, one of guidance and sharing best practice and information with those statutory responders. And part of what we've been doing recently is, at the request of the Mayor and indeed government, is pulling together those partner agencies to work through the implications of Brexit in its various guises and what those implications would be to London and the individual institutions themselves. It's ongoing work. It's fair to say that work is quite detailed. It's following government guidance that no doubt we'll get into a little bit later on, and providing that information back both to government and to the Mayor at his request.
Thank you very much for that. But just in terms of the work on resilience planning, really almost begun with both the dual request from government in early August and the mayoral request that highlighted a number of areas that he was concerned about, that he thought that you should be looking at. You've had one summit so far and then lots of side meetings. So I understand that. In terms of information, your report that you published this morning, and I understand I understand why the delay, because government was quite clear about that they needed to see what you were saying and how you were saying it. Have you got enough information or in terms of your report you're presenting, you're clearly saying you haven't got enough information to do adequate preparations, particularly in light of a no deal. Is that correct? I don't want to put words in your mouth. I'm trying to, because we've quickly gone through your document, I can read out what we think is the case, but you're the scribers of it. Where do you actually sit on that issue? Because it's a pretty, I mean, it's an important work, and I don't want to raise areas, but it's a bit worrying at this stage of what you've been asked to do, but you don't appear to be given any scenarios or any real very heavy detail to help you in your preparations.
I'll summarise it in the following way. I think in this profession, you can first of all never have sufficient information to make 100% guaranteed result, guidance or anything else. So I think there is a reality that any emergency planner or any resilience person would always say, I need more information, because that's the nature of us frankly wishing to respond to that. It is undoubtedly the case that there is not a lot of information around from government, because the details of any negotiations taking place are at best opaque and at best are kept within the confines of the negotiation team. Personally, I found that very understandable. The risk it presents to us is having to scenario plan on various things, whether it be the ability of EU nationals can continue to work under what premise, on whether we have sufficient resource in terms of environmental health, port staff and so on post-Brexit, and will we continue to be able to attract staff to work here, through to fundamental pieces around replacement of regulation and legislation that affect the way London operates. That, I think, is at the heart of what the two sentences in the report are trying to get at, that there isn't information, there isn't sufficient, so therefore any guidance or operational notes that are given have to be caveated that this is based upon the best information that we have at the moment as it's being released.
Okay, and the work that you've been requested by the Mayor and central government, does that sort of complicate issues, or do they complement issues in terms of going forward in terms of scenario planning?
I don't think they contradict each other. I think there are different aspects. Clearly, government is looking across the country at each of the resilience forums, of which London is one, to look for how we would be responding, what would need to take place. Within London, clearly, there are particular contexts and particular structures and particular requirements that you heard from the Mayor earlier on this morning that are in addition to those coming from central government. I don't think they're contradictory, Chair. I think they are at a bigger scale in terms of London than perhaps you'd see in Cumbria or somewhere like that.
And in terms of your work plan that you've identified in the various sectors, and I suppose I ought to read this into the records, so the impact of a no-deal Brexit on resilience. So in the health sector, you've come to a view that it's a significant impact, a significant negative impact on resilience within the health sector. You come to the view for local authorities, negative to significant negative impact on resilience. Emergency services, negative impact on resilience. Business, slight negative to negative impact on resilience. Transport and utilities, negative to significant negative impact on resilience. Environment, voluntary faith, slight negative to negative impact on resilience. On all those assessments, behind those sectors, there will be some detailed work that breaks down into giving that view of how you've reached that. We'd be correct in saying that work is going on through those syndicate groups as we speak, really, is ongoing work. Is that how it works in resilience?
It is a judgment at a moment in time based upon the people who contribute to it. It's fair to say that some of these groups are national by definition.
Yes.
Some of them, so water, utilities, energy, for an example, would take a national view of resilience rather than a local one. Others, like faith groups, are far more community-based and therefore will be feeding back what they're seeing and what they're responding to on a London or local neighbourhood level. I would also caution that these things do develop over time, and the impact, the job we're in, is identifying between the partners and encouraging them, partners by which I mean agencies or groups of agencies, to understand and identify what the risks and the impacts are likely to be, and then encourage them to mitigate those where they are negative. So, for an example, you would expect faith groups to build capability and capacity within their own communities to help people respond. Similarly with utilities and other firms.
And it's quite clear that no deal presents the greatest challenge to resilience planning rather than a deal, because things may well be clarified. There will be difficulties in transitional periods, but there will be something, if a deal is done, that would give guidance to...
Honestly,
they're all
Chair,
challenging, but
I
in
honestly,
degrees
Chair,
of
could
challenge.
not give you an answer to that because I have no idea what a potential deal or a no deal actually would mean in terms of the individual context and the individual businesses.
So in resilience planning, you obviously work to the most adverse, or the most adverse, or the most...
You identify the worst and the least worst.
Fine,
and then
thank you.
Individual organisations are asked to take their individual judgments on that based on the risk system of likelihood and impact.
Right, okay. I just want to clarify if I asked... and so further planning that you're undertaking in the coming months, you're at this point, in this moment in time?
So there's a work plan through to January 2019 that basically takes the work from the workshops on and continues to develop that, both in terms of information coming from government as that becomes clearer, and also within the individual business areas, whether they be utilities, private, public sector, and as they continue to develop their plans. The second piece is around the potential emergency capability and response to that. I know that, again, you've discussed food supply, border controls, the things that are frankly making the media at the moment, and how those develop, and the plans, therefore, are developed. And that work plan goes through, I think, to January 19, currently, the current defined work plan.
Okay. And can we just pick one of the sectors, and if you can give us pen pictures of some of the challenges they're facing. Let's go to local government. So I think I get the issue about EU nationals that may well be employees and issues there. What other things would be local government be looking at? And I get the community may be impact of preparing for, unfortunately, as we saw in the referendum, hate crime rises in tension in community areas. What's the bit in the middle, if there is such a thing as a middle, because it's not a middle, but they have to grapple with in local authorities in terms of what we think they're preparing for?
So in terms of, I think it falls into 3 or 4 areas, key areas. One is around workforce and the dependency that London has, certainly in terms of EU nationals working in public sector and particular parts of public sector as well, and whether those individuals, regardless of whether they're given assurance about continued work status in the UK, choose to stay. And I know from a city perspective we have lost a couple of members of staff already who've decided to go back to their countries of origin, if I put it that way, as a result of the decision that was taken. That is clearly one impact. The second one is in some particular professional areas there has been a virtual ceasing of people applying for public sector jobs. Here I'm thinking of environmental health, for example, and people with professional qualifications choosing to come to work in the UK given uncertainty. That will clearly require management within the local authorities in terms of workforce planning, and that work is carrying on. The one you alluded to is around community cohesion, and clearly some communities within London will be more adversely affected than others, and work is going on to try and make sure that the additional work in terms of bringing communities together takes place, and that will vary borough by borough. Some boroughs have chosen to appoint individual officers responsible for Brexit planning, if I can put it that way. Most have held some form of scrutiny or leadership challenge in that area anyway. The second one clearly is around structural funding that's received from Europe, and that will have a medium to longer term impact on some of the work that authorities can take place that can be done. And there's also a requirement for some of the regulation that we use and that local authorities are required to implement having to be reinstituted and brought back through the UK legislation system, and that clearly has an impact. I think it's best to say that the local authority context is probably best covered with a local authority and London councils, in truth, to look at the individual and collective impacts across all of it that I think you'd see from Brexit, a no-deal Brexit.
And I suppose there's a secondary bit where they're in partnership with others.
Yes.
So there may well be an impact between NHS work and local authorities, or an impact in local authority areas that they need to be aware of.
Almost certainly, and the potential, again, of an increase in requirements for some social care and particular support for individuals may be increasing, and some I know are looking at contingency planning for that aspect as well.
Thank you. Let's move on to Assembly Member Prince on his set of questions.
I think you've answered the questions already, Mr. Chair, in relation to local government.
Okay, let's move on then, and rightly pointed out, as I've gone into your territory, to Caroline on her set of questions.
Yeah, but I'm actually going to pick up a bit
fine.
more on
Of
the
course.
local government stuff, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Just in terms of the biggest risks and concerns that have been highlighted in the work of local government preparing for this unknown situation, whether it's no deal or a bad deal or whatever that kind of deal might be. What are the risks that you think that local authorities across London should be preparing for?
The ones that they themselves actually, so I don't be positioning, it is not for me or any agency to tell them.
Of course, but what do you think the risks are then that they might be advised to be looking out for?
The ones that I know that they're looking at,
Yeah.
based on the workshops and so on that we've been doing and pooling information, is clearly around workforce, is clearly around demand in terms of service demand, whether it's adult social care, whether it's education, for an example. Foreign language teaching is one of the peculiarities, for an example, that hadn't hit the radar until someone thought a number of foreign language teachers in the system actually are EU nationals, so they may choose to stay or to go. So there will be service-specific staffing issues. There certainly will be some around funding and European Social Fund and other funds coming from Brussels that are used within local government. There will certainly be skill shortages in ancillary in the supply chain, so building services, for an example, and some of the skill areas that we rely upon for building and construction, highways maintenance, and some of the other ancillary services. Predominantly, though, as you can tell, it's workforce related. Longer term, potentially reduction in business rates, for an example, potential change in terms of income areas that local authorities use, and again, increased costs in planning and responding to planning.
What do you think, though? I mean, one of the things that, as our meeting has progressed this morning, thinking, for instance, about food security, and the Mayor outlined the importance of thinking about food security, particularly in relation to low-income Londoners. I'm actually a councillor in Islington as well as being an Assembly member. And, I know there are a lot of people living in Islington who live on very precarious incomes, maybe working in the gig economy, where they're already experiencing food poverty and fuel poverty. So are local authorities preparing for the impact of, the possibility of food prices going up or of food shortages in terms of their local authority responsibilities and work?
Certainly, I have heard of some who are. And the reason I'm hesitating with this, Chair, is it's not the remit of the London Resilience Forum, of which I'm here representing, to dictate to agencies of the number there, of what they should be considering. It's simply to coordinate that and to challenge, to make sure that they're sharing information for the mitigation of those risks. To try and answer the question, though, just with that caveat, it's fair to say that a number of authorities have appointed, as I said before, specific officers, and some have done scrutiny specifically around this area to look at likely impact of Brexit on their communities, whether it be in terms of community tension, whether it be in particular terms of impact, as you've said, on food, some communities and specific food requirements, for example, and what those impacts would be. So I am aware of some that are doing that.
And are you able to answer, do you think that that the information that is out in the public domain means that is a rational, sensible decision on the part of those local authorities?
My experience is that my colleagues will make decisions based upon the best information that they have.
Thank you. And then my other question is, what advice have you given to the Mayor in terms of preparing for a no-deal scenario?
We've had the summit that I think you've heard about. That's been documented. The public document has been released, I think, this morning, which gives an indication of some of the areas of concern and some of the areas of planning that are needed. Beyond that, the advice is through the Deputy Mayor, who chairs the London Resilience Forum itself, to the Mayor and to the Mayor's office. It's done through that route.
And, because in this document that's come out today, and obviously we've all just seen it this morning, so there are, specific risks, particularly around the lack of information and the lack of information sharing, which you implied, sort of mentioned at the very beginning. Do you think that there's anything that the Mayor could be doing to try and overcome those particular problems about information? Is there anything that he could be doing on behalf of Londoners that would help to unblock that information flow?
I think raising the concern that the more information that is given as early as possible without necessarily negatively impacting our ability to negotiate the best deal for the country, bluntly, is helpful. Mm-hmm. Highlighting to various sectors that the need for cooperation, even in terms of non-disclosure between. One of the concerns clearly with this is there is a fair degree of dependency on private sector in provision of public sector goods and services within London. There are commercial constraints on some of these organisations, clearly sharing a lot of commercially sensitive data and how that would be done. Similarly, with some public sector organisations, they're not only, as I said a little bit earlier, based in London, they're based nationally, and therefore there will be different constraints placed upon them and different areas of concern that they're going to have with their relationships with government. So I think anything that the Mayor can do and is doing to try and encourage people to share information in a safe environment, which is what the forum does, to be able to allow people to make the best planning decisions that they can, is to be welcomed.
So, and in particular, presumably, that means these private sector organisations that are delivering public services, in a sense, it's if we're looking at really serious impacts on communities, then actually those commercial interests need to be, the public interest needs to come to the fore more, are you saying, in terms of those private sector organisations?
I do, and I put a little piece of context around this. It's very easy to think, because I think everyone does this, I certainly have, of thinking of Brexit as a peculiarity in the resilience term. This is a series of events that we respond to by encouraging joint working, by encouraging information sharing, by working through consequences, if you like, business continuity. So how do we make sure that the work of local government, this adult social care, children's services, continues regardless? And working through the consequences of Brexit and what is likely to happen as a result of it, and how would we mitigate the service impact or the risks involved, is almost daily work for John and colleagues. So this is a different set of circumstances. We'd apply the same structures, constructs that we do for other things, and simply make sure where we can we mitigate, where we can't we understand, and raise attention to the right agencies in government and elsewhere to say we need support in this area to be able to mitigate the risk to the public. And where we can't, highlight and flag it.
And do you think that the highlighting and flagging is happening enough, given that people are concerned about what they can and can't say?
I think the government, from my experience, government is aware of the concern that there is a dire need and a desperate need and a constant need for more information. I'm not sure they're able to give it because I'm not sure they have the knowledge to be able to impart it. But we will continue and have continued simply to keep pressing. We need to understand as soon as you know, for planning purposes, to mitigate the risks that are in the system. And
is there a point, because we've got an actual known deadline here of the 29th of March of next year, and that's 5 months away. Is there a point at which you have to stop being open to all these possibilities and being good civil servants, and actually say we have a crisis? You must have a deadline in your heads of when, by which point you need to have more information in order not to have a cliff edge catastrophe on the 29th of March? What's your deadline that you're working to?
Sadly, I don't have one. And I don't have a catastrophe. And the reason I don't do that is because the planning assumptions and the understanding of the different agencies involved, and in the end it is a responsibility of all of those 108, whatever it is, agencies to make sure their own plans exist. The forum's job is the coordination and the understanding of the system risk in that. That the situation will develop anyway to the point at which the cliff edge for us would not be there, in my view, because there will be a series of decisions being taken and a series of requests, requirements, if you will, for information that will be surfaced as we move towards March that will hopefully start to mitigate some of those risks. So we'll understand, for an example, very clearly the status and the ability of EU nationals to work in the UK. We'll understand, because local authorities will be testing with staff, are you going to be staying with us, please, for the next year or so as a social worker? So the idea of cliff edge and some of this I just don't think is applicable in the context of service provision. I think in the context of some of the service sectors, food for an example and so on, their knowledge and their understanding will become far clearer as they understand the likelihood or otherwise of a deal. And again, I don't see that as being cliff edge in that sense, as much as we start understanding the mitigation that needs to take place, the likelihood of fresh food coming in and so on.
So, okay.
Sorry, I'll be quite specific,
I know
because
you're being
otherwise
very,
the language
very specific,
becomes
but
very
and I probably
weaponised,
didn't.
if I can put it that way.
No, of course.
That's not
but I'm also, I'm trying to understand for Londoners. For instance, you talk about food, and you say that that the information will become clearer. Do you have a sense of when that, at what? Because for the people who are charged with supplying food, they have to have their plans in place. We've heard that stockpiling food isn't realistic, so there's got to be some other kind of plan in place. Are they working to deadlines by when they need to know more so that they can put different plans into place?
Yeah, and following recent conversations with central government and DEXU, the Department for Exiting Europe, who are leading all of the planning, I think it would be wrong to suggest from the report that it's a bad relationship with government. Actually, it's an extremely good relationship with government. There is just a frustration on all sides of the lack of information or the lack of the ability to determine the reasonable worst case scenario that we're working to.
Just to be clear, it's difficult for you to determine what the worst case scenario might be.
Yeah, we can't foresee the future. There are so many options and variables in this in terms of there being a deal or not being a deal.
So it's difficult to determine what the worst case scenario might be. So how can London be resilient and ready for a worst case scenario if that can't be, if you just don't have the information to determine what that might be that you need to plan for?
So that's everything that we're working through at the moment, working closely with government. As you can see in the work plan, we've invested in putting more detail into a risk assessment, working closely with each of the agencies to try and determine. But the picture changes almost on a day-by-day basis as to what the outcome will look like. We haven't heard what the deal will look like. We don't know what the implications. We have some broad areas, as John has spoken to, of areas that we're concerned on and we're putting effort into working through. But the point I was going to make in terms of government, they are now looking in their raft of the 105 technical notices. They're looking at where the deadlines are and communicating through either HMRC or known small businesses where there is a deadline for them to meet, i.e. they have to work back on 4 months implementation of any of those work streams and communicating directly to the businesses as best as they can. So some of this work is ongoing in terms of where there is a definite 3-month limit, a 4-month limit in terms of putting systems in place.
So those limits are going to be coming. I mean, we've got 5 months, so 3 months, 4 months. We're beginning to be approaching some limits where information from government is critical that they give it. And are you confident that you will get that information?
Yeah, and that was the latest update from DEXU, that they're working through all of those deadlines and working to communicate and to provide better public communications in the work that they're doing.
Which, if I can just add, is why the work programme looks forward to January next year, because of the timing of the information that is being expected to be released and the point at which we'll be able to make some informed decisions and informed recommendations back through the Mayor and other agencies at that time. That's why the January deadline.
Sorry to interrupt. So is that when I should bring you back?
You should certainly bring someone, but hopefully the chair of the LR potentially will be here. But yes, you should, Chair. I think January would be a reasonable time to come back.
And January is a whole month. Sorry, the beginning or the end?
Whenever the committee feels appropriate.
Thank you.
Caroline Pidgeon.
I have to say, both Johns, you are incredibly calm. Probably why you work in this field of resilience, considering everything we've been hearing this morning. And surely the threat of no deal is your worst case scenario you'll be working to.
The threat of not having sufficient information come March is the biggest threat, because you can manage most things, given the right amount of information and sufficient time to get people and colleagues together. I have great faith in individuals and institutions to be adaptable and to work things through. The risk is not knowing and not being told.
So if you know it's a no deal, therefore this is the consequence.
It's Rumsfeldian, if I can put it that way. You know, it's a known is the ideal. The unknown known is where we probably are at the moment.
One of the things we touched on earlier with the Mayor is the issue of medicines, and we haven't looked at that. Are you confident around that field? Because that is an area that certainly we're concerned about, and I also raised with the Mayor the very specific issue around some treatments for cancer, which come with medical radioisotopes. I think it's a technical name, which can't be stockpiled. Have you been looking at scenarios around that, to how you can make sure that those medicines are available?
Those areas are frankly specifically looked at by the NHS, so the detail of mitigation and plans for those, and for the medical side you would need to take evidence from the NHS. I couldn't answer.
Do they not feed into your work for London?
It would, the NHS would, and it's part of their individual contingency plan. Where it cuts across to others would be in things, for an example, like adult social care within local authorities, and the increased demand on care, potentially increased demand on care services from that. And that's an area that is being looked at between the two agencies.
So that is the area that you're particularly
It is particularly that one.
Okay. I wanted to pick up what concerns the partner bodies that you work with have fed to you about the risks to law and order.
Mm-hmm. So I think and I'll let John sort of pick up from this, but in terms of that, there is clearly concern in some local authority areas around community tension between local community groups as a result of this. Particularly concerned to make sure that activity does take place in some community areas, for an example, to encourage people to work together, to encourage communities to work across. And that's an area that there is active work taking place. In terms of the public order and potential disorder issues, that would be one more for the Met Police to deal with as an individual agency under the Mayor, rather than the Resiliency Partnership. And it's not been an area that was raised specifically at the meetings we've had.
Are they not part of your partnership?
They are, but it's the law and order piece, I would argue, in terms of the response to that outside of the community engagement work that local authorities and other partners would do, would be one for the Met rather than for us.
But if there are huge tensions across the streets of London, if there were, I don't know, riots on the streets of London, that's not only a law and order issue.
Correct.
That's a much wider piece there that would involve local authorities and others.
Which is why I said that the local authorities are doing work in specific community groups, looking at reducing community tensions between and inside those groups.
Right.
I think it also be wise to bring in, as John said earlier, each organisation has its own duties to put in place the business continuity measures for their sector and organisation. So what we don't want to do is replicate or those at the London level. What we concentrate on is the capability of the partnership to come together to respond to an acute shock at a time, and thereby work together to resolve an issue. And we're confident that we have those plans in place. We've seen over the last few years that the partnership does come together swiftly and that we have the right arrangements. So we always have those arrangements, whether there's an incident now or whether we need it at the time over the period that we exit the EU.
I think, can I just build on that a little bit? Because one of the things goes back to the point I made earlier. A lot of this work is about ensuring that the existing plans that we have, for an example, around civil unrest, are tested against what is a likely Brexit scenario or not. The plans would exist regardless of whether it's Brexit or some other incident, and we've seen that in the past, in recent past in London, and the response of the partnership to that. So the testing here is about existing plans, and would they be fit for purpose in the likely scenarios that we may see on a no-deal Brexit, as opposed to writing a new plan from scratch. That wouldn't be the way we do it.
Okay. In terms of obviously the fire brigade, we haven't really focused on them at all this morning, but what are their particular concerns around Brexit and what they're planning for?
Again, I'm not here to speak on behalf of the fire brigade. I think you'd have to speak to them individually. I think across the partnership we can surmise that the supply chain issues, the workforce issues and the general uncertainty are highlighted in the report, and they're common to all pretty much, but I wouldn't go into any of the specifics for the fire brigade.
And just in terms of some of this planning and being on a list, of course, all the, you're just one group coordinating it, and the subgroups and a lot of people on the ground doing different bits of work. Somewhere on terms of business resilience, no deal. Lots of preparations are taken across the EU. We heard about from the Mayor earlier on about his business hub advice, which I think has been well received, about information that people can rely on and use. If a scenario of a no deal is there, and we know that big business, and all due respect, some of the businesses in the city are fine, they can look after themselves, they've got good sector issues and advice to follow. Those small, medium-sized companies are obviously involved in their sectors, but in terms of being told how do they manage their supply in event of a no deal, and advice around some of those issues, do we look to government to do that, or do we initiate that here in London? And is somewhere in your coordination someone picking that up?
So that there is a business group within the Resiliency Forum representing large to small to SMEs, so Federation of Small Business, people like that. So the work that the GLA has been doing, or the Mayor's been doing around advice to SMEs is very helpful in that regard, specific local advice for Londoners, for London small businesses. Just to pick up one point, there are 12,000 SMEs in the City of London. So everywhere is a small business in that sense. The larger ones, yes, are clearly more capable in the sense of having capacity to do this. So the coordination and strength and correct advice to businesses is quite key. Again, it goes back to the terms, frankly, of workforce, of capability, of ability to continue, regulation being transferable and brought across, as well as supply chain would be the other area that's
Now, your local authority is very good at supporting some of that business sector in providing some of that information and supporting that issues. Is that an aspect that other local authorities are picking up on, where it might not have been on their main agenda? But if they've not got enough businesses of a critical mass to have the capacity to deal with that and aware, is that being shared? Do you see that as part of business resilience, being shared about what good practice might well be in this scenario?
It's fair to say it's a developing area because the local sub-regions, Central London Forward and some of the others, for an example, are sharing experience across. And where the local authorities themselves have done a risk assessment and got the Brexit officer, if you will, or the Brexit scrutiny taking place, that exactly does fit on that agenda and does fit on that.
Right, thank you.
As I say, the Mayor's piece of work is very helpful in acting as a clearinghouse, as it were, for small businesses to be able to get the information.
I'll just go back to an earlier question that Caroline said. One of your key issues in your report is you're about to write to central government to request further specific information and planning assumptions. Now, is that a rather substantial letter? Is there a longer list, or is it quite constrained? You actually are pinpointing where it is, or are we talking about something more substantial? And are we doing it just from your point of coordination, or is it in terms of the sectors? Because I presume some of the sector groups might well be writing their letter, and are they sharing that with you? Because in this world of information, and no one really wants to show their hand, or for all sorts of reasons. So where are we?
So I think as the report sets out, we are have further information from government. So part of the letter is to put on an official record. All of the points raised in here, we will surmise it into the letter so that we seek clarity. And on Tuesday, we met with the Brexit programme working group. And we've put out to all of the agencies that are represented there to feed in further specific questions that they want raised so that we can have a documented record going forward to central government requesting that information. So yes, we're going out to all of the partners and we will summate all of our concerns from the report into a constructed letter that goes from the London Resilience Forum, so it's in an official form to central government to request for more information.
Okay, I haven't spoken to my colleagues, but I ought to give you notice in January. This will be one of the areas that we're going to be honing in on. We will see as far as possible. I'm not, I'm not into shroud waving, or I don't want to create a fear of crime, but I think it's important that we understand what you professionally are asking and requesting to do your work, and how far you've received that enables you to do that job. And at some stage, again, I don't particularly want redacted, and I don't particularly want to stray into the confidentiality. At the moment, I don't feel I need this urgently. You are the best people to do that and pursue that. But I think in January, I will want to know how far you've got and the response you've had back. And I think my colleagues would share that, and we want to come back and look at that very closely. So I thought it'd be fair to raise that. Okay, are there any further questions on the panel? Can I thank you? As in the past, we can't thank you and your teams in different bits enough for this hidden but important piece of work for Londoners, to be honest, in terms of resilience planning in its many forms. So can you pass that back through your forums around that? There may well be some issues that we might wish to follow up once we've reflected further about what you've said and we've cross-checked that in terms of the Mayor. If there are issues in terms that you feel able, that you think is important for us to follow, then we'd like you to talk to our officers in the Secretariat. And at this stage, of course, if that's, if it's confidential, it remains confidential, but of course we think it's important that people are sharing this information, because I think that's important in terms of the nature of some of your resilience work. But we are conscious, and I think to reinforce where the Mayor says, we don't want people to start a fear of this. It's a question of planning in an orderly way and dealing with problems as they arise or before they arise. So thank you for that. So we will come back to you. There are no further questions, so can we note the information that's been placed on our agenda in a calm way, and note the way that you've answered our questions. Thank you very much. We can go back to the main agenda in terms of whatever formal business we've got to do. Let's just look at that. Item 5, date of next meeting is the 30th of October, and it's 3:30 and it will be in the chamber. I've got any other urgent business, so I now declare the Mayor this meeting closed. Not the Mayor closed.
Closing the Mayor.